I had gotten home from work about an hour earlier and had already settled in for the night. I was sitting on my bed watching TV while a storm raged outside. We don't usually get many big thunderstorms around here, so nights like that always make me a little nervous. A little while into the storm, I heard something below me, some kind of noise coming from downstairs in one of the rooms. At first, I assumed it was just the house creaking, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away, so I got up and checked anyway. When I looked around, there was nothing out of place. I filled up my water bottle and went back upstairs to my room. I had only been back up there for a few minutes when I heard another sound. This time, it was something I recognized instantly, the very specific noise of one of my living room lamps falling over. I know that sounds oddly specific, but that lamp was very unstable and would often fall if someone bumped into it. Because of where I had placed it, I bumped into it pretty often myself. Even though it was wobbly, though, it had never fallen over completely on its own before. I got up again and went downstairs to the living room, and sure enough, the lamp was lying in the middle of the floor. I walked over and picked it up, but something about the whole situation didn't feel right. The storm wasn't shaking the house much at all, so the lamp tipping over by itself just didn't make sense to me. Still, there wasn't anything else to suggest what could have caused it, so I almost had to assume that's what happened. Even then, deep down in my gut, I knew that probably wasn't the case. I checked around the rest of the downstairs area for anything unusual, but eventually I went back upstairs to my room. This time, I turned down the volume on the TV so I could listen to the storm more carefully, wondering if maybe it was stronger than I thought and actually shaking the house. I stayed up there for a while longer, probably around 45 minutes, when suddenly I noticed the sound of the rain getting louder. Maybe it had been like that for a while and I hadn't noticed, but it sounded different somehow, almost like the rain was inside the walls. It's hard to describe, but something about it just felt off. I opened my bedroom door and immediately heard the sound more clearly, and it was definitely coming from downstairs. I slowly walked down and followed the noise through the hallway. At the end of the hall near the kitchen, there was an awkward little door that led to a storage closet, and I knew there was a window inside that closet. The closer I got, the clearer it became that the sound of rain was pouring in from behind that door. My anxiety started building as I reached for the handle and slowly opened it. Inside, I saw the window wide open. Water had already begun puddling on the boxes stacked underneath it, and rain was slapping hard against the windowsill. I hadn't been inside that storage closet for at least 6 months, but I knew for an absolute fact that I would never have touched that window, let alone left it open. I quickly shut it to block out the sound of the rain, then turned and faced the rest of my house, completely terrified and literally shaking. That's when I realized I had made a huge mistake. I had left my phone upstairs on my bed. At that moment, I had 2 choices: run upstairs to grab my phone or just run out of the house. I was so scared that I couldn't even think straight. Trying to stay as quiet as possible, I carefully grabbed my car keys from the kitchen and started slowly walking down the hallway toward the front door, hoping that if someone really was inside the house, they wouldn't hear me. I had only made it about halfway down the hall when suddenly I heard a burst of footsteps sprinting down the upstairs hallway directly below me. They were heading straight toward the stairs. Panic took over instantly. I ran to the front door as fast as I could. I could hear the footsteps getting closer to the bottom of the stairs as I threw the door open and ran out into the rain. I jumped into my car, backed out of the driveway, and drove away without even looking back. Once I was down the road, I managed to call 911 from my car. When the officers arrived at the house, they didn't find anyone inside, just an empty home. But after investigating further, they realized something interesting. The wall inside the storage closet with the window ran along the same wall as the end table where the lamp had been sitting. The officers said that whoever tried to force open that old window likely caused vibrations that knocked the lamp over earlier. Whoever broke in apparently didn't leave any clues about what they were there for. It seemed like they had found somewhere upstairs to hide and were probably waiting for me to go to sleep before doing whatever they planned to do, whether that was rob me or something worse. Even now, it still really disturbs me to think about the fact that someone was walking around inside my home that night, right outside my bedroom door, while I was just sitting in my room watching TV. And to this day, I still randomly feel unsettled when I'm just hanging around my house, like I'm not alone.
It was a pretty typical night in the middle of March, and at the time I was working at a gas station. Normally I handled afternoon shifts, but every once in a while I would cover someone's overnight shift if they needed it. That morning I got a call asking if I could come in from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., and since the entire shift would count as overtime, I agreed almost immediately. When I arrived, I took over for the manager and settled in behind the front counter. Outside, it was already pouring rain, and there were warnings that a major storm would be rolling in later that night. The weather seemed to keep most people at home because the gas station was completely dead. After sitting inside for about an hour with almost no customers, I threw on my raincoat and ran outside to prepare the station for the storm. There were a bunch of loose items around the pumps that needed to be brought inside before the winds picked up. I started gathering them one by one, running back and forth between the pumps in the building to drop them off inside. As I grabbed the last few things, I noticed a man not too far from the gas station. He was standing along the side of the street, pacing back and forth while getting absolutely drenched by the rain. It seemed strange, but I figured he was probably just waiting for someone to pick him up. After finishing the last of the cleanup, I headed back inside. About 2 hours later, thunder started rumbling in the distance, and soon after that, the storm finally arrived. Heavy winds and even harsher rain came crashing in all at once. I knew the weather was supposed to get bad, but this was on another level. The wind slamming into the sides of the building was actually making the entire room shake, and at one point I thought the front doors were going to snap right off their hinges because they suddenly swung open so violently. I rushed over and secured the bolt lock to keep them from blowing open again. After that, I moved toward the back of the building and stepped into the storage room so I could stay away from the windows while the storm passed. Then I just waited. I'd say it was maybe 30 minutes after the storm had started. I was still standing in the back when, through all the violent wind and rain, I heard a faint muffled sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was, but after hearing it several more times, I realized someone was banging on the front doors. I left the storage room and looked out across the sales floor. Sure enough, there was someone outside, staring in through the glass and pounding repeatedly on the doors. I hurried over and unlocked them, thinking the person must be in trouble and needed help. As soon as the door opened, the man rushed inside, and I quickly shut and locked it again behind him. He was completely soaked, with water pouring off his jacket and forming puddles on the floor. What struck me as strange, though, was that he didn't thank me or explain why he needed to come inside. Instead, he just started pacing back and forth across the floor. That's when I realized it was the same man I had seen earlier out by the road. Had he really been out there that entire time? It had been over 2 hours since I first noticed him. I tried asking if he was okay and whether I needed to call someone for help, but he didn't answer. He just kept pacing the floor with this blank, hollow look in his eyes. After watching him for a minute, I started feeling extremely uncomfortable. I slowly walked toward the front desk, planning to call the police. But the moment I picked up the phone, the man suddenly stopped pacing. His eyes snapped toward me instantly. As we stood there looking at each other, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. His hands were cut up badly, right across the knuckles. They were bruised and covered with blood. I realized I had been staring too long, and by the time I looked back up at his face, I could tell he was angry. "Don't," he said sharply, clearly referring to the phone in my hand. I didn't want to push him, so I slowly lowered it back down. For a few seconds, he just stared at me as if he was deciding whether or not to do something. Then, without another word, he turned and continued pacing across the floor. Outside, the storm kept growing worse, violently shaking the building and making the whole situation feel even more terrifying. I stood there trying to figure out my options while this man, who honestly felt like a complete maniac, walked around just a few feet away from me. I could try running, but I would have to unlock the door first and then somehow outrun him in the middle of a raging storm, which seemed incredibly risky. I could try calling the police again and hope he just left, but that also felt dangerous. Strangely enough, the option I ended up choosing was probably the riskiest one of all, doing nothing and simply waiting. So I stood there and watched him pace the floor for what felt like forever, at least 20 minutes. At any moment, he could have snapped and attacked me, but he never did. Finally, after those long minutes passed, he stopped pacing and looked at me one last time. Without saying anything, he walked over to the door, slid the bolt lock open, and stepped back out into the storm. The moment he disappeared into the rain, I grabbed the phone and called the police. I'm not sure if it was because of the storm or because they didn't think the situation was urgent, but it took more than half an hour for an officer to finally arrive. By then, whoever that man was had completely vanished. They never found him. The next day, after the storm had finally passed, a report came out about a missing woman. She had never returned home that night after leaving her office around 11 p.m. Maybe I'm connecting things that have nothing to do with each other, but the man who came into the gas station clearly looked like he had just been in a violent fight. His knuckles were bruised and bloody, and the timeline seemed to match up. Again, it's all just speculation, but whatever was happening that night, I was right in the middle of it. And ever since then, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it.
I was driving home after a late shift at work. I worked in security, so my hours were always kind of unpredictable. And that night, I didn't get off until around 1 a.m. A heavy storm had rolled in, and the rain was coming down hard enough that water had started building up along the sides of the roads. There were barely any other cars out at that hour, especially with the weather being so bad. Normally, the route I take home avoids the main roads and instead cuts through smaller, quieter streets. For some reason, though, it didn't occur to me at the time that I probably should have stuck to the main roads that night, even if they weren't busy either. As I continued down one of these narrow side roads, I eventually came to a section where the road was completely flooded. It was difficult to tell exactly how deep the water was, but from the way it spread across the road, it looked like it could have been several feet deep. There was no way I felt comfortable driving through that. Realizing I'd have to turn around and drive all the way back the way I came, I felt pretty frustrated. I shifted my car into reverse and began backing up so I could do a 3-point turn. But suddenly, my car started frantically beeping. I slammed on the brakes, confused about what was happening, and then looked over my shoulder through the back window. Right behind me, literally only about 2 feet from my bumper, was another car. It honestly felt like a jump scare. During the entire 10-minute drive down that empty one-lane road, I hadn't seen a single car either ahead of me or behind me. And even stranger, the car sitting there had its headlights completely turned off. I just sat there for a moment, expecting them to either notice that I was backing up and move, or see the flooded road ahead and decide to turn around themselves. But they didn't do anything. They just stayed parked right behind me. The rain tapping against my car and my headlights being the only thing illuminating the dark road made the situation feel even more unsettling. Eventually, I honked my horn a few times. The longer I sat there, though, the more I started to feel like something about this situation was seriously wrong. Then, without warning, the driver's door of the car behind me opened. A man stepped out wearing dark clothing with a hood pulled up over most of his face. He slowly walked up to my window and knocked on the glass a few times. I didn't open it. The man didn't say anything either. He just kept knocking. Standing out there in the middle of a storm on a deserted road, silently knocking on my window, the whole thing felt incredibly creepy. At the time, the only explanation I could come up with was that maybe he was drunk. I decided to put my car into drive and inch forward carefully, making sure not to move too far into the flooded section of the road. But as I slowly rolled forward, the man followed alongside my window the entire time. The way he was acting, combined with the
fact that his car didn't even have its headlights on made me even more convinced that he had to be intoxicated. I was still nervous, but I thought I had figured out what was going on. Then, completely out of nowhere, someone knocked on the other side of my car. I turned my head and saw another man standing there, dressed in the same type of dark clothing. Behind him, I could even see a third figure approaching my vehicle. For a split second, I was completely stunned, but I quickly realized I was running out of time. I stopped being cautious about the flooded road and focused only on turning my car around as fast as possible. At one point, my tires lost traction for a good 3 or 4 seconds, and I thought I had pushed too far into the water and gotten stuck. Somehow, though, the car regained traction just in time. I managed to swing around, slip past them, and speed away from the area. As soon as I made it back to the main road, I called the police. Officers drove out to the scene later that night, and strangely enough, the car that had been behind me was still sitting there near the flooded section of the road, but none of the men were anywhere to be found. When they investigated further, they discovered that the car actually belonged to a dealership located hundreds of miles away and had been reported stolen months earlier. To this day, I still don't really know what was happening on that road or how close I might have been to something truly horrible. And the truth is, I probably never will.